Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni has refused to sign the recently passed Anti-Homosexuality Bill into law. He has sent it back for further amendments. Museveni's decision comes after he met with his party's MPs, who overwhelmingly voted to pass the bill last month. The president has faced pressure to veto the bill. Last month, the economic freedom fighters led a bill protest against this. For more on this, we are joined by EFF Member of Parliament Piaba Madokwe. MP, very good afternoon. Appreciate your time. What is your reaction to the decision by President Museveni to return the Anti-Homosexuality Bill to the Ugandan Parliament for review?
Thank you very much, Hugo. I think when one read the first few lines that he had refused to sign the Parliament, there was an element of hope and jubilation up until one read further and understood what the reasons were, which, according to the reports, is that he wants to put a clause. He agrees 100% with everything that is in the bill, but he wants to put a clause where there must be provisions for rehabilitation of homosexual people, which also, again, further entrenches the very same things that we've been protesting about, the very same things that people have been calling about, that the bill altogether should be scrapped. And what should happen instead is that Uganda must actually embrace all people regardless of their sexuality. Not only because it's the most basic thing that you need to do, and not only because the bill infringes on basic human rights, but because Uganda has actually signed is part of some of the legislation within the UN, which is against homosexuality. So they've actually just backtracked even on some of the things that they are signatories to. But over and above that, it just cannot be correct that people can be criminalized to a point of being killed, because the bill also says, look, they will actually even consider death penalty just because of who they choose to love, just because of how they choose to express their sexuality, and just because they choose to embrace their gender identity. Because whether we like it or not, we need to understand that society is advancing. Our understanding of how we relate to each other is developing and changing as well. And we no longer live in a world where it's just males and females, or in a world where it's just binary. And we need to, as a society, start now embracing, understanding that there are other genders and sexualities as well that we need to consider. And the calls, like I said, for not just of the EFF, when we made the picket to the Ugandan embassy and we submitted a memorandum, it is also calls that are being made by the international community. It is also being made by gender activists and LGBTQI activists of Uganda, who have actually had to exile, to run away. They do not have homes as it is. And it cannot be that in 2023 we are speaking about Africans that are displaced because of the decisions that their lawmakers are making.
Ms. Madokwe, if you'll allow me to come in, you've talked about the efforts that you put in as EFF. You picketed a few days ago at the Ugandan embassy in Pretoria. We also understand that the United Nations has made their sentiments known, as has the United States and potentially many other countries on the international landscape. But very few of those countries are African. What do you have to say about how Africans perceive homosexuality? Because Uganda is not alone, certainly, in these homophobic views that they have.
No, that is actually true. And I think that's what I actually wanted to say as well, that perhaps what Uganda is doing is actually being the most extreme in terms of their homophobia, in terms of them being anti-LGBTQI+. But the reality is that it sort of brings forth the conversation as well, that not only African countries, by the way, but also the world itself is still very much anti the LGBTQI community. That is why you still have these movements in other countries. That's why even the United Nations was able to go to the USA and call on the Biden administration to say, yes, you are set to have one of the most progressive laws when it comes to the LGBTQI+ communities. But some of your states are actually reviewing these laws. Some of your states are actually now going again and putting out very homophobic laws, and you need to get that into check. And I do not think that it is actually correct that all African countries are quiet or that African countries are embracing what Ugandan government is doing. But it is just that even South Africa, for instance, it is not only the EFF, there's been different organizations within, there's been different organizations across the continent, by the way, that has been speaking out against this. Governments have also, I would assume that in the AU, and because they are signatories to these laws that bind the African countries as well to be in support of the LGBTQI plus community, they are signatories to that, including Uganda. That's why we say that. But you cannot be that you are a signatory to these laws and then you come back and you introduce an anti-homosexuality bill. And again, it goes back to what we're saying, that it's basic human rights. African countries are the last countries to actually be perpetuating any form of anti-human rights, because we come from a very deep and a very dark history. And some of the things that are being perpetuated by these anti-homosexuality bills are not different to some of the things that were perpetuated through the coloniality, through apartheid. Even some of the laws, like if you look at the laws that outlawed people from marrying across races, it is not so different when you look at that and you look at this. But we have advanced from that, we've embraced that, and nothing has happened to African countries after that has happened. So why is it that we now are able to say we cannot allow people to love who they want to love? But the reality is that we also need to be honest ourselves, including as South Africans, that there is a huge disjuncture between the legislation that is there, even by these countries, whether it's South Africa, whether it's the United States, whether it's Britain, and the implementation. The LGBTQI plus community the world over is still persecuted. It is still being made to feel like it is a by the way, it's an afterthought. Even in South Africa, we have the best laws. There is no anti-homosexuality bill in South Africa, but in terms of how we relate to the LGBTQI community as a society, it shows that there is still a lot of deep-rooted homosexuality. That's why we even went further and we said, look, even when we spoke about gender and sexuality in our own 2019 manifesto in relation to South Africa, we said that there needs to be educating. We need to educate society. We need to go and introducing gender and sexuality classes in primary schools, in high schools, and in institutions of higher learning, because there is a lot of unlearning that needs to be done. And up until we get to that point where we understand that who people choose to love, and that anyone who belongs to the LGBTQI plus community is still a human being, and they also have the right to enjoy the very same human rights that we all enjoy as black people or as people, regardless of what color we are.
Ms. Madokwe, let me put this to you. Where do you draw the line between a sovereign nation's values and beliefs, and certainly what the world or the globe is thinking? Give an example, Qatar 2022. There were multiple issues around the queer community and them not being accepted in Qatar, and many laws and restrictions that were implemented.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like I said, that we need to understand that society has advanced. And I think to a certain extent we need to understand that perhaps society is advancing much further and
Sorry, I must ask, when you talk about society, who do you refer to? Because society is the Ugandans, and the Ugandans are saying no to homosexuality. Society is
I'm talking about society in general. And what I'm saying is that in terms of the conversations that we are having about sexuality, the conversations we're having about relations that human beings have with each other, whether it is across race lines, whether it's across sexuality lines, it is at a much more advanced stage, but it is just that some other members of society, including in South Africa, like I said, including the US and whatnot, they have not caught on to that, which therefore means that there then becomes a responsibility for those who have caught on and understood that human rights are human rights. It does not matter who stands to benefit. And we need to all, as members of society or generally as human beings, to move from the premise that whatever the other person does, that does not harm what myself or the next person, then there should not be any problems, because you can come and say that, no, Ugandans have a right to their sovereignty, they have a right to their religious beliefs. But if those religious beliefs and that sovereignty is on the basis or is on the premise of infringing on other people's human rights, then there's a huge, serious problem. And society as well, we must also understand that the LGBTQI plus community of Uganda is also part of that society, and it must be catered for.
Final question before we let you go, ma'am. You've talked about the work that you've done, certainly as far as picketing is concerned, at the Ugandan embassy. But let's talk about diplomatic conversations. Are you having any conversations as the EFF with political parties across the continent, particularly in Uganda, to try and find resolution for these problems?
No, definitely we are having those conversations. Like I said, that these conversations, especially on LGBTQI plus rights and human rights and all these things, are had by African countries in platforms such as the AU, platforms such as the Pan-Africanist Parliament and all these things. So it is on that premise that we are having those conversations. The EFF is also having those conversations with different organizations and human rights and LGBTQI communities in different parts of the world who are actually in support of the LGBTQI plus community in Uganda. Like, for instance, in the picket that we had, did not just wake up and went to a picket. It is because the people of Uganda, or those that were persecuted, said, look, we need someone to speak on our behalf. And that is why you even had like an LGBTQI plus activist in the picket saying, look, I am not here on political affiliation. I am not here as a member of the EFF or a supporter. I do not even know the EFF, but because they are speaking on our behalf, I felt that I must be here because they are speaking for us. And it is not only them, it's other people as well, other Ugandans that are exiled, that went on social media and they said that we are also experiencing the same thing, and we are grateful for what the EFF has done. So what we are busy now doing is that we are creating those networks so that we can actually figure out how bad or how deep the situation is and where the intervention might be. But that intervention will not come from the EFF alone. It will have to, like you said, come from diplomatic conversations where all African countries must actually call out Uganda, in addition to the fact that the international community is speaking, in addition to the fact that the United States is also speaking. But as African countries, we need to figure out a way of actually fixing our problems as African countries.
EFF Member of Parliament Piaba Madokwe, appreciate your time this afternoon.